Most of us grow up believing the modern world operates by a set of rules. After the devastation of the 20th century, international institutions like the United Nations were established to prevent atrocities and ensure that rogue nations face accountability. But the reality of global justice looks different when we examine specific, documented violations of those rules, like the deployment of white phosphorus by Israel in civilian areas of Lebanon and Gaza. White phosphorus is an incendiary chemical that ignites on contact with oxygen and burns through human tissue down to the bone. Because it is nearly impossible to extinguish, international law strictly prohibits its use in densely populated civilian areas. If a developing nation like Lebanon had used this exact weapon, the global response would be predictable. We would see immediate sanctions, a surge of media outrage, and high-level calls for military intervention to uphold the rules-based order. Despite confirmed use by the Israeli military, the consequences were non-existent. There were no sanctions and no arms embargoes, only verbal condemnations and diplomatic protests that changed nothing on the ground. This consistent gap between the written rules and their enforcement suggests that the international legal system functions with a specific selective logic, one that we are only beginning to uncover. To understand why certain nations enjoy this immunity, we have to look past the stated justifications for war and examine the underlying economic and strategic motives of global superpowers. In 1953, the United States and the UK orchestrated a coup in Iran known as Operation Ajax. They deliberately overthrew the democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, for the specific purpose of protecting Western oil interests and reinstalling a compliant monarch. Decades later, we saw this pattern repeat in Iraq. The 2003 invasion was sold to the public using fabricated claims of weapons of mass destruction, but the actual drivers were geopolitical and economic interests that local warnings and international law could not stop. This shows the petrodollar system, a core pillar of American power. Middle Eastern oil is traded exclusively in US dollars, securing immense US global economic dominance. When leaders in Iraq or Libya threatened this dominance with alternative currencies, Western intervention followed, shattering their internal stability. Widespread regional chaos, hundreds of thousands of deaths, and the rise of terror groups were the foreseeable, documented costs of a strategy prioritized over human life to maintain global hegemony. The architects of this power also built a way to legally insulate themselves. This brings us to the physical center of international law, where the rules are managed. This demonstrates the United Nations' structural handicap. While 193 nations form the General Assembly, binding authority rests with 5 permanent Security Council members who hold absolute veto power. The US has weaponized this veto over 40 times to block accountability for Israel, nullifying the world's will. This diplomatic shield is reinforced by $3.8 billion in annual military aid from the US to Israel, creating a relationship where the protector becomes directly complicit in the actions of the protected. When the UN issues a statement of condemnation, it functions as a theatrical performance. It satisfies the public's desire for a moral response, while ensuring that nothing actually changes for the victims on the ground. Western media narratives support this by framing Western military actions as missions of liberation, while labeling any retaliation against this exploitation as terrorism. These combined forces create a two-tiered system. International law acts as a weapon to punish the weak, and a shield to protect the powerful. The United Nations still performs vital humanitarian work through agencies like the WHO or UNICEF. However, it was never meant to hold the world's most powerful nations accountable. It was designed to manage the conflicts of smaller states. We see this impotence at the International Court of Justice. The court can order measures to prevent genocide, as it did with Israel, but it lacks any physical mechanism to enforce those rulings against a superpower's ally. This is a complex world with multiple drivers of war, from European colonial legacies to the regional ambitions of Russia and China. The United States is not the single reason for every conflict, but the immense suffering caused specifically by the U.S. pursuit of economic dominance is an undeniable reality. Serious historians and scholars, from Noam Chomsky to John Mearsheimer, have documented the human cost of this pursuit. Billions of people across the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and Latin America live with the results of this double standard. Their anger at the system is a logical response to a lived reality. We cannot expect true accountability from the current international order. The architecture of impunity was specifically built to protect its architects.